A few months ago, something happened that I'll never forget. I've been driving for Lyft for a few years now, usually working the late-night shifts. The roads are quieter, and the tips tend to be better. But there's a trade-off. Every once in a while, you get a ride that sticks with you, not in a good way. I always considered myself careful. I'd dealt with some odd passengers before, but nothing, and I mean nothing, came close to the experience I'm about to share. At the time, I didn't have a dash cam. After that night, I immediately installed one. It started off like any other night, just me, my car, and the occasional odd sound from my trusty but beat-up 2005 Volvo. It's old but reliable. The streets were deserted, which I prefer. Sometime after 2 a.m., I got a request from a convenience store nearby. Seemed harmless enough, but something about it made me uneasy. You ever get that gut feeling that something's just off? That's exactly what hit me as I approached the pickup spot. Before I even saw the guy, I understood why I felt that way. The convenience store was closed, lights off, no cars in the lot. As I got closer, I saw him. He was pacing outside, wearing a ragged hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. A hole in the sleeve, jittery movements, and constant glances over his shoulder, like he was afraid someone was following him. If I had to guess, he was on something. I hesitated. My finger hovered over the cancel button. I should have just driven away. But for some reason, I didn't. Instead, I unlocked the doors. He slid into the back seat without a word. And the second I took my foot off the brake, I regretted it. Most passengers either stare at their phones or out the window. Not this guy. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror. Not blinking, not looking away. Just staring. His eyes held this strange mix of anger and something else I couldn't place. I tried to ignore him, turned on the radio to break the silence. The moment music filled the car, he snapped, "Turn it off." His voice was deep, raspy. A smoker, no doubt. His sudden outburst startled me. My hands tensed on the steering wheel. Without a word, I reached over and switched the radio off. Silence. For a while, I hoped, he'd just sit there quietly until we reached his stop. But then he spoke. "You ever pick up someone you shouldn't have?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I let out an awkward laugh. "Well, I hope not." He didn't react, just leaned back and muttered something to himself. Then he started talking about how he used to drive for Uber, but quit after some guys stole from his car. He slurred his words, making it hard to understand everything. But one thing stood out. He was smiling the whole time. Who smiles when talking about getting robbed? Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Funny, isn't it, how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you? That was it. That was the moment my brain stopped seeing him as just some high stranger. He was a threat. My pulse raced. My eyes locked on the road, but my mind was spinning. I glanced at the GPS, focusing on the destination like it was a lifeline, but he wouldn't stop talking, babbling. Some of it made sense, some of it didn't. Then he started apologizing. "I didn't mean it," he kept repeating it. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it." I didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't want to find out. We were just minutes from his stop when he suddenly snapped out of his trance. He yelled, "You missed the turn." I hadn't. The GPS showed we were on track, but out of fear, I slammed on the brakes. My hands shook as I put the car in park. Then headlights appeared behind us. A police car. I silently prayed, watched as it drove slowly past, its spotlight briefly sweeping over my car. In an instant, the guy in my back seat slouched down, trying to stay out of sight. I turned my head just enough to see him lying almost perfectly flat across the seat, his eyes closed. My heart pounded. I forced myself to look straight ahead, pretending I hadn't noticed. He stayed like that for way too long. I wanted to tell him to get out, but I was afraid of what he might do. Finally, he sat up, looked at me, and said, "You got lucky." Then, without another word, he opened the door and disappeared into the night. I ended my shift early, drove home, shaken. I couldn't stop thinking about what had almost happened. Weeks later, I found out something that made my stomach turn. A news article popped up on my phone. A convenience store had been robbed the same night I picked up that passenger, just 2 blocks from where I got him. I had been inches away from a dangerous criminal, someone who could have hurt me if he wanted to. I debated calling the police but decided against it. For personal reasons, I try to avoid law enforcement, and honestly, I wasn't sure if my report would even matter at that point. But one thing's for sure, I'm a lot more careful about who I let into my car now. She lived just 10 minutes down the trail, which didn't seem far, until you factored in how dense the woods were. You could get turned around just looking for firewood. She was in her late 60s, with unusually long gray hair and piercing blue eyes that made you feel like she could see right through you. She wasn't exactly rude, just blunt. She welcomed me to the woods with a small nod, extending a basket toward me, as if expecting me to take it. There wasn't much of a choice. She practically shoved it in my hands. It seemed like an act of hospitality, but something about her felt off. I grabbed the basket instinctively, though I'd never been treated like that by a neighbor before. It wasn't anything alarming, just unfamiliar. I thanked her, but she stared at me as if waiting for something more. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just smiled awkwardly. She kept watching me, confirming my suspicion that she didn't interact with people often. Finally, she spoke. Her exact words, ones I'd never forget, were, "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." It wasn't normal advice. It felt more like a warning, as if she was reciting from an old rule book. I nodded, smiled again, and turned back toward my cabin. As I shut the door, I paused, waiting to hear her footsteps retreat. But she didn't move for at least 45 seconds. That was probably the strangest part of the whole interaction. Despite the odd vibe, I appreciated the gesture. She seemed reclusive, but not unfriendly. The kind of person who'd help you if needed, but wouldn't go out of her way to pry. I reassured myself that it was good to have someone nearby, even if I didn't expect to need her. I set the basket down in the living room and quickly forgot about it. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in, rare for Oregon, but not impossible. I lit a few candles, curled up with a book, and tried to ignore the flickering power. Some might find that level of isolation scary, but I actually enjoyed it. Listening to the rain, the thunder, it was soothing, until the knock at the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It wasn't a polite knock. It was more like banging, forceful, urgent. My heart pounded as I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight and approached the door. Peering through the small glass pane, I saw Michelle, drenched and clutching her own flashlight. I opened the door, barely able to greet her before she blurted out, "I saw someone near your wood pile." The words sent a chill through me. I stepped onto the porch, shining my light toward the trees. Nothing but rain and darkness. I asked if she was sure. She nodded, eyes darting toward the woods, as if expecting someone to emerge. The whole situation was unnerving. I scanned the tree line, but the storm made it impossible to see anything clearly. Before I could respond, Michelle simply said, "Be careful," then turned and walked away, unfazed by the downpour. I watched her disappear down the path before stepping back inside. The second I shut the door, it hit me. How could she have seen someone near my wood pile? Her cabin was 10 minutes away. That meant she had already been on my property before she saw anything. Why was she near my house in a thunderstorm? Was she lying? The whole thing felt wrong, but marching over to her place in the middle of a storm wasn't an option. Instead, I locked every door and window and stayed on edge, listening to every creak and gust of wind. The storm eventually calmed, but my nerves didn't. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sharp snap outside my window. A branch breaking. I'm a light sleeper. I knew what I heard. I froze, straining to listen. Slowly, I crept to the window, hoping, praying that I'd see nothing. At first, I didn't. Then I spotted her. Michelle stood at the edge of the woods, body slightly turned away from my house. I recognized her by her long, tangled hair. The moonlight barely illuminated her figure, but I knew it was her. I held my breath as she started turning toward me. Before she could catch me looking, I ducked. I stayed crouched, heart hammering in my chest. After what felt like forever, I mustered the courage to peek again. She was gone. I sat there, pulse racing. Up until then, I thought she was just a strange neighbor. Now, I wasn't so sure. I didn't sleep after that. A few hours later, just as I was starting to relax, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was quiet, almost hesitant. I wasn't about to answer. Instead, I crept toward the door and glanced through the window. It wasn't Michelle. A burly man with a thick beard stood on my porch. He looked rough, like someone who had been living out in the woods. My stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed at me to hide. I backed away silently, then locked myself in the bathroom and called the police. As I whispered to the dispatcher, the banging started. Not polite knocks. Full-force, violent slams. The door gave way. I heard him enter, glass breaking, wood splintering. My heart pounded as I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath. Minutes passed like hours. Then, silence. The police arrived surprisingly fast, but by then he was gone. They searched the area half-heartedly, claiming the woods were too dense to find anyone. I begged them to check Michelle's cabin, hoping for answers. When we got there, my stomach twisted. The place was abandoned. According to the police, no one had lived there in decades. I argued, told them I'd spoken to Michelle, that she had knocked on my door just hours ago. They brushed it off, saying I was probably mistaken. I moved out the next day. Some people think Michelle was a spirit trying to warn me, watching over my cabin for reasons unknown. Others believe she and the man were squatters who had been hiding there all along. I don't know what to believe. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin, and I'll never forget that night.